Okay, so before we get started, just so you know, this looks like weird and bruised. I'm not like being abused, or I'm not clumsy enough to be running myself into walls. I'm trying to get back into competitive fencing shape. I was a competitive fencer for quite a long time, and then it kind of fell by the wayside, and so I'm trying to get back. And obviously I am bearing the brunt of some of those exercises, so sorry, try to ignore this and focus on the Hamilton or the colors of the bookshelves. Try not to focus on my pajama pants, which are going to show themselves as I sit here. Hold on, let's see if I can get this frame. There we go. So, hi guys! I am back for another episode of our writing talk, our Shades of Writing talk, and today I am going to talk about world building. This is a very tricky thing. I did a poll and I was like really hoping that people would pick the easy thing for me to talk about, and of course they chose world building, and that's fine. It's just, I'm sure if you write at all, you might have noticed world building is difficult. It is hard, and similarly, it can be really hard to talk about. So this will probably actually be the first of several posts in the future on world building, just because I'm sure that I will forget some things. Also, second disclaimer, even more than any other topic that I talk about, this is a really subjective take on world building. Different writers take on world building. You can see the cat shadow. Different writers take on world building. Hold on. I'll bring the bench closer in case he decides to join us. So different writers attack world building in completely different ways, right? What works for me is not going to work for you. What works for you won't work for me, and vice versa. So my observations is what they should be called today instead of advice or anything else. My observations on world building are obviously highly specific to what works for me, because who knows, something might speak to you. It seemed like the video about shiny new ideas spoke to a lot of people, and so my hope is that this will speak to you guys as well. I'm trying to figure out if my sleeves are at different heights. I'm so weird about t-shirts, and so that means you get this like awesome look at all of that, like, yeah, in there. But anyway, if you've read any of my books, you'll notice probably that world building is very, very important to me. On the off chance that you have read all of my books or read back towards the beginning, towards the near witch, what I'm about to say has applied to every single one of my books. And that's rare for me. For me, most of what I'm doing changes from book to book. So anytime I actually have something that applies to more than one or two books, then I start to look at it for myself as a pretty good rule or indication of something that's working. So I look at world building and setting as a character. Not only that, I look at it as the first character. A lot of other writers will start with a plot or a character, and I might start with seeds of plot or seeds of character, but the thing that I develop before I develop anything else in my story is the world. And I do it for a very specific reason. I write primarily about outsiders. Outsiders are my main characters. An outsider can be someone who is literally from outside of an environment, or someone who's born within an environment and yet feels like an outsider. So whatever makes us feel other, right? Now, having main characters who are outsiders, in order to write outsiders, you really have to understand insiders. In order to understand insiders, you have to understand the societies and the worlds that they fit comfortably into, so that you can write the outsiders as kind of perpendicular. So with that in mind, once I get those little seeds of story, seeds of plot, seeds of character, I put on the brakes. And before I do any kind of deep development into those characters, I start fleshing out the world. Now, I'm a very broad strokes world builder, which means I do not write a 300-page manual of the details of my world. I would drive myself crazy. So what I do instead is I try to design my worlds. Most of them have a magical component to it. I try to design my worlds with a very intuitive system, a naturalistic system. Essentially, even though you're coming at this world as the reader without knowing anything, I want to give you something that feels like solid ground to stand on. And one of the ways to do that is to make the world very accessible. So I try to make my worlds very accessible. And that's kind of part and parcel of making broad strokes world design, because it means that I don't write myself easily into a corner. If you start dictating from the minutia outward, right, and detailing every small detail of your world, every little modicum, with the same importance, then what happens is you create rules which you then cannot bend or break later. And that can be really problematic if you're writing a series or something. So what I try to do is I try to write in very broad, intuitive, naturalistic terms. So with the Shades of Magic series, I knew I want 4 Londons. Here are the relationships that I want each London to have to magic. Now, by designing it that way, and by designing magic as a largely elemental system in one world and a sub-dom system in another world, etc., I allowed myself to create a general framework for magic in the world without dictating, here is exactly what a spell must look like at every step of the way. And when you start making absolutes like that, that's when you can't break your rules without really losing a reader's trust. And so I wanted to design the Shades of Magic series in such a way with a really good, broad understanding that would then allow me to go in as the series was continuing and start adding in details like Alucard Emery's power to see the threads of magic that didn't directly contradict rules that I had set out earlier. And part of what this falls into for me is this mental divide between 2 kinds of fantasy writers, the door writers and the window writers, okay? A fantasy writer who's a door writer writes you a door into a world and allows the reader to walk through the door and see everything. And they dictate everything that the reader will see. That's that high detail. If I'm not telling you, the rules, it's people that write themselves into corners most often because they're trying to dictate the entirety of the room. And then what if they decide that they want, the room to be a different shape, or they want something else in the room they haven't allowed for it? I am a window writer, and what that means is if you have a window writer, you will never get the full view of that world. You'll get a window into it. And what that means is I give my readers this window through which to see my world, and they get a limited perspective into that world, but the information that they get allows them to infer things that they cannot see, right? It's big concepts. This is going to be a very rambling post, and I'm sorry for it, but the idea then is that if I can dictate some specific details which are highly relevant and give you a general understanding of the rest, then you as the reader will be able to infer these things, which then allows me as the writer to have an additive creative process in which I write new details into the world that do not contradict what the reader has in their head because there's space for it, because it's out of sight, and because it doesn't directly contradict. Now, the contradiction is very important there. I'm not going to suddenly be like in book 3 of the Shades of Magic series, oh, P.S. there are dragons. And there's actually a joke in the book wherein Delilah Bard learns about something called the sea serpents when she and Alucard Emery are at sea. And she's like, holy crap, you guys have like giant man-eating serpents in this world? And Alucard Emery's like, no. That's just the name for some, like, assassins. And she's like, hey, I don't know where the lions are. You have magic. And so it's tongue-in-cheek, but it's actually really important to me, both as a reader and a writer, that you don't do kitchen sink. That's not what a window perspective is allowing you to do, because when you have a window style of a book, you are still dictating some really important rules and parameters. You're just not showing every corner and every crevice, But it can be, as a writer, a very freeing experience because you make sure that you write space to expand that room out of sight, to add in new windows, to add in new space, to build the house of the series. So, oh God, there are so many different concepts to world building. I'm trying to figure out which ones to save for later. We're just going to make it a long video, right? So the other thing that I want to talk about with world building is one of the questions I get asked more than anything is this idea of how much detail, right? The phobia for writers, the thing that we all have to worry about is the info dump, the dreaded info dump, where you just like drop information on your reader. And I'm a firm believer of shorthand, right? And what I mean by shorthand is picking an element of the world that is going to do a lot of the big work for you in small ways. And so for some authors who are writing fantasy, that's the food. For some, it's the clothing. For some, it's, you know, what have you. And for me, it's language, right? And I love language as a shorthand development for a world because it tells you so much. The example I always use is a curse word, right? The way we curse can tell the reader if there is a God in this society, what they worship, what they fear. You know, the language provides us hierarchies, provides us insider-outsider divisions, provides us so many nuances. When I'm designing that kind of original world building, broad strokes, I design curse words, I design language divides and barriers. I love to have a character who is kind of on the same page as the reader and doesn't speak a language. I design songs and poems and tavern names and ships, these little pieces which are meant to give you a much broader idea. And so if I can give you an ingredient, a piece of it, it's amazing what readers can do in terms of fleshing out the rest. You know, part of this comes down to trust in the reader, and part of it comes down to the reader's trust in the author. So it's a really complicated scenario. The last thing I'm going to say in this video, because this seriously could be like an hour-long video, and I will come back and I will do more on here, is as a writer, be very, very cognizant of your perspective when it comes to world building. Not meaning you as the author, though that's valid as well. I mean the character. If you're writing from the perspective of a character who was born and raised in your world, they are not going to notice the same things as a person who is visiting your environment for the very first time. Use the lens of the character whose perspective you're writing in or near to help dictate the kinds of information you tell the reader about the world. One, because it will add authenticity to the character's perspective, and two, it will help you decide which information is pertinent. So many writers, especially newer writers, have a very hard time determining what is relevant information, what is too much information. For every 10 pages of backstory and world building design an author has, usually like a paragraph max gets into a book, and it can be really hard to decide what is important. Should I be going for the big details or should I be going for the small details? I usually believe in the small details, which tell you a little bit more about the big details through inference, but when you're writing, remember whose head you are in or near, or whatever it is, depending on the perspective that you're writing. August Flynn, in the Savage song and in our Dark Duet, he is a musician. And so much of his interaction with his environment is through musicality, right? Rai Maresh is a prince who was raised in Red London, and there's no world in which he perceives Red London in the same way as Delilah Bard, who is an outsider, right? And so just make sure that if you're feeling overwhelmed by the quantity of information, one, you can always pull back as you do revisions, but also just really think about whose eyes you're looking through, you know? So that's an overwhelming video, basically setting as character, world building as kind of the fundamental foundation on which we build our rooms and houses, doors versus windows, perspective. I could go on, but I'm going to stop there for now, and I will pick up next week, and I hope you enjoy.